Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Tonight, I would like to pick up on a very interesting video that has been produced by Free Talk, Blessed Mhlanga, in which he was interviewing the Honorable former MP, Margaret Dongo. In this video, she raises a number of very interesting points. And I would like to encourage any one of the people out there to visit the site and listen to the video for themselves. One of the things that she brings up was the issue of where did Zimbabwe go wrong? I think it is a pertinent issue and one that should be rightly explored. But that question, where did we go wrong, I think was answered very well by Dr. Simba Makoni himself, a former minister during the Mugabe era, finance minister, and one of the key leaders in independent Zimbabwe. In his recent interview with Trevor Ngube. So before I go to Margaret Dongo, let's just listen to what Dr. Simba Makoni said. Where did Zimbabwe go wrong? And that question, I think he answered it beautifully.
I recall very clearly that when we came into office in 1980, we inherited Ian Smith's systems. And Ian Smith's ministers drove Peugeot 504s. They drove themselves from home to work in their Land Rovers and all in kinds. Most of them were farmers. They parked their Land Rover and then they used the government vehicle when they were at work with a chauffeur. When they finished at night, they packed them and they took theirs to go home. Within the month of our coming into office, Prime Minister Mugabe then directed that every minister be issued with an E-class Mercedes-Benz. And the Peugeot 504s were retired to permanent secretaries, and the deputy ministers then took over. We can also look at many other things, small they may appear at the time. Let me hazard that even at that point, Enos Nkala was our Minister of Finance. I don't think we knew what budget we inherited from Ian Smith when the decision was taken to buy those E-class fleets for the ministers. So the material affection for material themes has always been with us. And the differentiation also, even going back into the camps, Zema Shefu, Neze, my comrades, Makada, were not the same. So much so that even today, when the so-called Minister for Presidential Affairs or Provincial Governor, as they were, goes to Bubi or Binga, they will be served separately and differently from the other people. The avarice grew as we began to exploit the opportunities of office. When I was in the government, the minister was allocated one vehicle that they kept, which was the sedan they used in town. If you needed to go off-road, then your ministry hired off-road vehicles from the CMED, and you were charged for it. Now a minister will have an average of 4 vehicles in his forecourt, all at government's expense.
So the leadership modeled the wrong kind of behavior, and that kind of behavior permeated all across our society. or CEOs, like you're saying, heads of parastatals and so forth, modeled from the top.
Indeed. Indeed. I made a passing reference that we have CEOs who will buy themselves a luxury car when they can't pay wages at the end of the week or end of the month. This has been so entrenched in our psyche, this showing off, as if you are a different person. You're breathing different air from those who don't drive Prados and Land Cruisers, from those who don't drive Jeep Cherokees. We have lost our humanity. There's lots of reference to Ubuntu, very farcical, superficial, not coming from the heart. We have changed. We have changed because of our appetite for power. And we have changed because of our avarice for material things. I think when we begin to associate a position of authority and responsibility with material well-being and acquisitions, that's when the rot set in. A Toyota Cressida isn't worth much compared to 6 kgs of gold and 15 billion worth of Marangwe diamonds and backhanders on contracts to pave 200 kilometers of roads. So when you ask, is there a moment? There is not one, but quite clearly, I think we began to change noticeably in the latter half of the 80s into the early 90s. Our character became preoccupied with power, with control, and with accumulation. That's where I would put the starting line.
Well, that would be one way of putting it. I'll put it slightly differently. I would say what Mugabe was doing there is bribing his fellow Zanu PF leaders, members of parliament, ministers, deputy ministers, to forget what they were there for. Who would want to risk losing his E-Class Mercedes-Benz on all these pegs by criticizing Mugabe? That is where the rot started. One of the things that Margaret Dongo would be known in Zimbabwe's history was when she criticized their fellow Zanu PF leaders, MPs, deputy ministers, and ministers for groveling to Mugabe. Mugabe was running the country as if he was the Sultan, running his group of concubines. And so she infamously called a fellow Zanu PF leaders Vakadzi va Mugabe, in sheer frustration at how they never ever stood up to Mugabe. In the early 80s, that Dr. Makoni was referring to there, this is when Mugabe launched his infamous Gukurahundi massacre. The primary purpose of the Gukurahundi massacre was to coerce the late Dr. Joshua Nkomo and his fellow PF ZAPU members to give up their ambition to remain as an independent party that will challenge Zanu PF for office. Those who know the history of Zimbabwe will tell you that ever since the formation of ZANU and ZAPU, the two parties, yes, had been fighting to end white colonial rule, but they were also fighting among themselves for domination. There were several attempts to unite the two parties for no other reason other than that they wanted a de facto one-party state. But all attempts to unite the two parties failed because the leaders on both sides wanted to be the dominant. And so in 1979, when they were in the Lancaster House conference talks, the two parties never really pushed for a de facto one-party state because they had not really united to form one party. And so the Lancaster House Constitution was meant Zimbabwe to have a multi-party democracy. But the thought of losing power was so powerful, particularly in Robert Mugabe and his friends, that their campaign for the 1980 elections left no one in any doubt that if the party does not win the elections, the Bush war would continue. And so the people of Zimbabwe voted to end the Bush war in 1980. Nothing at all to do with one man, one vote. And as soon as Mugabe got into power, he started bribing those around him so that, like Margaret Dongo said, they became his concubines. They did his bidding. And indeed, that is what happened. Even when Mugabe launched the Gukurahundi, none of Mugabe's ministers ever voiced and say, this is not right. How could they do that? And risk losing the E-Class, Mercedes-Benz, and all these other packs that they were getting as chefs. That is where the rot started. And I applaud, and I've always applauded Margaret Dongo for highlighting that point. Corruption has become rampant, and all for the purposes of, as long as you are enjoying the benefits of being a chef and promoting the de facto one-party state, your performance in that position was irrelevant. So gross mismanagement became the order of the day. Corruption became the order of the day. But they were all overlooked as long as you are serving the primary purpose of keeping the dictator in power, of keeping Zanu PF in power. That is where we went wrong. In this interview, Blessed asked Margaret Dongo a pertinent question. Why are the rural people still voting for Zanu PF? I think this is a question that has been misread by those who have failed to read the history of Zimbabwe. I think she answered it beautifully. And I'll just play a snippet of that answer.
It had not been availed. What were we going to do in the rural? Rural people are treated like second-class citizens. So for me, I feel that we have been betrayed because the priorities for the government do not benefit the majority, let alone even those that are in the urban areas.
But in the rural, it's you who vote more for Zanu PF than anyone else.
Yes. Do you know the reason why the rural people vote for Zanu PF? One, they're intimidated. Two, the policy is that the rural people should remain poor and subservient to the government. They should remain poor. Because if they remain poor, they continue singing the song for their master. This is why these people have been impoverished. It's for a reason. Because at the moment, if you economically empower these people, they'll go out of hand. Zanu PF will never have control over them. But because now there's drought, they want to feed from Zanu PF the handouts. They have to remain loyal to Zanu PF.
I think that is an important point. And it's a pity that many people have overlooked that. It is very common to hear people talking of, oh, it is the rural people who vote for Zanu PF. Those people have no choice. The one thing that would empower the rural voter is to give them ownership of the land on which they build their hearts. That would be the most economically empowering thing. It is interesting to note that even before independence, the likes of the late John Robertson, he was a banker and an economist, advised Ian Smith that Zimbabwe or Rhodesia then would do even better as a nation economically if the blacks were given ownership of the land. They were given, be it 5 acres or so of the land on which they build their house. Giving them title deeds would give them collateral security. And with that, they could go to the bank and borrow money on the strength of that to build a decent home, for instance. To plant, they will have the confidence to develop that 5 acres. But Ian Smith said no. For the simple reason that Ian Smith did not want the blacks to have the confidence to say, this is my land. You can't push me around. Ian Smith feared that the blacks would become politically independent. He didn't want that. The white man's farms, mines, and industries depended on cheap labor from the blacks. And as long as you keep the blacks poor, they will always seek employment and be exploited by the whites. And an economically empowered black it would have been just a matter of time before they also asserted their political muscle as well. A meaningful vote in the governance of the country. Blacks didn't have a vote in Rhodesia. And Ian Smith was hell-bent on keeping it that way. And so Ian Smith rejected John Robertson's proposal to let the blacks have ownership of the land. It is interesting to note that John Robertson, after independence, according to his own statement, gave Robert Mugabe and his regime the same economic analysis, the same argument that Zimbabwe would do very well economically if the black peasants would give ownership to the land. And he rejected it for the same reason. Yes, Mugabe has made a big song and dance about the land redistribution. The truth of the matter is, most of the seized white-owned farms were never given to the peasants. The few who got the land, they got it with an offer letter from government. And many have since learned that that offer letter is conditional to continued support of the party. And those who were found wanting on that respect, they found themselves with the letter being withdrawn. The only people, only blacks who own land in Zimbabwe are the few ruling elite. And those who bought it before or soon after independence, they had been given to those who had title deeds. What she is saying here is very true. Zanu PF, it is in the interest of Zanu PF to keep the rural people poor. We saw after last year's elections how the Zanu PF regime revisited blacks. Claiming that they'd been resettled. Some of them had been living on that piece of land for the last 20 years. And all of a sudden, this regime decided that they were resettled incorrectly. Whoever had settled them there, some of them were resettled by Zanu PF leaders themselves, who had given them the piece of land to buy their votes. But now that the elections were over, and maybe the politician had lost power, some of them were given by village heads or chiefs, the regime turned around and said those people didn't have the authority. And that was the end of it. And they were forcefully removed from those lands. Where they've been resettled, they do not have ownership of that piece of land. And so they know that if the regime's ruling elite wake up one morning from the wrong side of the bed, they could be moved again. What Margaret Dongo is saying here, many people have said before, and it is true, that Zanu PF is deliberately keeping the millions of ordinary Zimbabweans poor for the sake of controlling them. There is no reason, there is no secret in the saying that the rural areas remain Zanu PF strongholds. Not because the Zanu PF has done a lot for the rural people, but because they, the rural people, are the most vulnerable in Zimbabwe society today. Most of the people in the diaspora, for instance, who decide that they need to build a decent home, most of them you'll find they will endeavor to buy a piece of land in the urban centers where they will at least have the title deeds to that piece of land. Even if it's just big enough to build a house, they would want to grow their own crops, keep a few animals. But in the urban centers, most of the stands are just enough for a house. But they would rather go for that than go to their rural home, where they know that even if they build a decent home, they may find themselves being accused of supporting the opposition. And they know that once they are so accused, they are in serious trouble. Zanu PF operatives will be on their case. They will be harassed, tormented, and forced, and many have been forced to even abandon their decent home for the peace of mind. The solution in Zimbabwe remains, and I stated, there is absolutely no excuse why 44 years after independence, an overwhelming majority of Zimbabweans in the rural areas are not allowed to own even 2 acres on which the house stands. This must be corrected. This must be corrected as a matter of urgency. There is absolutely no excuse for it. The other aspect, which I think, in answering that question, where did we go wrong? We, as a nation, by the late 1990s, did realize that Zanu PF will remain in office as long as they're able to rig elections. And therefore, then, the rallying call was, we need democratic change to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections and to give the ordinary Zimbabweans a meaningful say in the governance of the country. That was the right call. And Morgan Tsvangirai and his friends launched their party in 1999, riding on the wave of the need for democratic change. And they even called their party the movement for democratic change. Alas, when they got into power, they were corrupted, just as easily as Mugabe had corrupted his own Zanu PF ministers. Morgan Tsvangirai and friends were given the trappings of high office. The same way that Mugabe gave Simba Makoni and his fellow Zanu PF colleagues the trappings of high office, and they forgot about the liberation, ideals of freedom and liberty for all. In the case of Morgan Tsvangirai, they forgot about the reforms completely. During the GNU of 2008 to 2013, Morgan Tsvangirai had the golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms. He failed to implement even one, for no other reason than that Mugabe had bribed the MDC leaders to forget about the reforms. It is a great pity that even now, with the benefit of hindsight, some Zimbabweans out there still fail to accept that MDC leaders sold out. It is disappointing. Those who do not learn from the past are destined to repeat the same mistake over and over again. And this, alas, is exactly what is happening here. Zimbabweans failed to realize that Mugabe had bribed his fellow Zanu PF officials so that they were now bakadzi va Mugabe. And we should have learned from that. We didn't. We should have picked the men and women whom we wanted to implement the democratic reforms more carefully. And even more urgently, we should have at least had a common sense of accepting when they had failed. MDC CCC leaders have been on the political stage for the last 24 years now, including the 5 years in the GNU. How is it possible that we are failing to see that they failed to implement even one democratic reform? Where did we go wrong? Margaret Dongo asked. Well, we failed. We set up, we risked life and limb and livelihoods to elect MDC leaders to implement reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. And last year, Zanu PF blatantly rigged the elections because no reforms had been implemented. Why Zimbabweans out there are failing to see that? Beggars belief. We talked about the rural voters who are voting for Zanu PF out of fear. The urban voters are voting for the opposition out of ignorance. How could they be so ignorant that they didn't even see that Chamisa was lying about I've plugged all the vote rigging loopholes? Triple C will win big. When all was trying to hide is the fact that Triple C were participating in these elections out of greed. Ironically, MDC leaders themselves have admitted the folly of participating in these flawed elections. This is a quotation from an interview that Tendai Biti gave in 2015, emphasizing the folly of participating in flawed elections. He was trying to speak to his fellow opposition leaders. And when they failed to listen to him, he gave in. If you can't beat them, join them. And he started participating in these flawed elections. David Coulthard, in his book, talked of the same year, 2013 elections, as flawed, so illegal, that the logical step was to withdraw. But he went one step further and explained why both MDCT and MDCN did not withdraw. Greed. MDC leaders participated in last year's elections, knowing fully well that Zanu PF was rigging those elections. Knowing fully well that by participating, they're giving Zanu PF legitimacy. I'm very pleased to note that in this interview, Margaret Dongo, at least, was one of the few who saw through what was happening here. That Triple C participated in these elections out of greed and was not afraid to say so. Let's just listen to what she had to say.
The first thing that I want to tell you is that there's the ordinary citizen is exploited. Each time the currencies are changed, we lose money. We lose money. And I have no doubt it pays for the bills and the corruption that is happening in this country. We have lost a lot of money, a lot of savings because of the change of currency. So you can't actually embark on any project, because if you embark on any project, there's no guarantee that you sail through.
You keep talking about corruption. How deep, how endemic is corruption in this country? From you, I mean, you sit in the Central Committee, and I'm sure you still have colleagues.
It's like tea. Chai, Kenyans call it chai. It's like tea. Now it's no longer in the hierarchy only. It's now it is developed even in the grassroots. It's even more ways in the grassroots, because these are the grassroots people who see their leaders being corrupt. So they are thinking that it's a type of life that should exist. And the corruption is shrunk right to the grassroots. There's now corruption everywhere. Worse off with the leadership. Because they have a look. You asked me a very good question. You were in the Central Committee. You were a member of Parliament. You were this and that. Why are you feeling the pinch? It's because, I didn't believe in corruption. I'm not a selfish person. I'm a selfless person. And I'm like a social worker. Politics is not a business. This is what I want to remind most of our MPs and other people.
Do you think they look at it as a business?
Yes, they look at it as a business, because they look at it as a business seriously. Because the moment they go, business and employment creation, because if they go to parliament, you are employed. You get a car, you get a stable salary, and you are paid until your term is over. Already you are employed. If you're out of employment.
If you serve 2 terms, you get a pension?
You get a pension. Then already. This is why people kill in politics. They kill to be in parliament. This is why we have violence in this country, because there is no employment. The only employment which is there is in politics. There is no other outside employment. So for them, a very good example is, look at what happened to CCC, the Triple C party. Have a look. When they lost, when they said they were rigged, what I expected from them, I expected all parliamentarians to say, we are not going to go to participate in a rigged system. And we are not going to sit in a rigged parliament, because the elections have been rigged. So all of us were not going to parliament. Imagine what could have happened. We could have gone into new elections. There's no way Zanu PF was going to roll alone.
You think so?
Yes.
Do they care?
Caring or not caring, the public would have forced them, because the majority of the people would want representation in parliament.
But they went anyway?
But they went. They realized that, you know, you heard them complain, I used my own money to be in parliament. But what about me who have voted for you? I used my own money. So the idea is to recover. Is it a business where you want to recover your losses? Is it a business? Politics, is it a business where everyone else, when you get in parliament, you want to recover your losses? A good example is now, parliamentarians have been elected. I don't know when we last saw our member of parliament in this area. And some of them, they tell you straight away that we are looking for money, so that when it comes back to re-election, we want to feed our people. We want to buy our votes. They're very open.
We can stop it there. The point she's making there is a pertinent question. It's a pertinent point, rather. Triple C leaders, even when SADC and the AU election observers had condemned last year's elections as flawed and illegal, they still insisted in taking up their seats. As she correctly said there, they were claiming, oh no, we funded ourselves. What about the people who voted for you? You were telling them that you had plugged all the vote rigging loopholes, when in fact you were lying. All you wanted is those few seats that Zanu PF was offering to entice the opposition to participate. SADC would have acted on Zimbabwe's rigged elections, last year's rigged elections, because their own report by the SADC election observer team was very clear. Those elections were flawed. But how could SADC take that issue any further when the main opposition itself, which was Triple C, and its head of wildebeest followers had participated in those elections in their millions? If Zimbabweans themselves are willing to participate in the flawed and illegal elections, SADC has no say in it. That point must be made. That point cannot be denied. It's ironic that now the same Triple C leaders are accusing SADC of letting Zimbabwe down, when the truth is they are the ones who let the country down. And it's a pity that particularly those urban voters are so naive and gullible. They were easily conned into participating in these flawed elections. I can forgive the rule of order if you've got thugs who come to you and say you must register with the party and we have got a tag on you. If you do not vote, we will know that you didn't vote. If you vote for the opposition, we will know that you voted for the opposition, and they will punish you for it. And there have been many instances of ordinary people in the rural areas being punished. The urban voter is the one that Zanu PF has got the least control over. Who controls them? The opposition. And the opposition control them by telling them lies. And they believe it. We are now going to move into the 2028 elections. And Chamisa is gearing to play the same card. He is going to form his new party. CCC was formed just 2 years before the elections. And he assured his wildebeest head of followers that he was going to win those elections. He was going to win big. He had plugged all the vote rigging loopholes, and the head believed him. And already the head is getting agitated. They can't wait for Chamisa to launch his new party. And they will participate in those flawed elections just as blindly as they did in the past. Where did we go wrong? I think by failing to educate most of our voters, particularly those in the urban centers, is where we have gone completely wrong, because that is where we've got the opportunity to make a real difference. What is disappointing is, of course, you have some of the people in the urban centers, low density suburbs like Mount Pleasant, Greendale, Borodale, and many in the diaspora who have university qualifications, professionals in their own right. And yet, they are some of the most ardent Chamisa supporters you'll ever find anywhere. They are the ones posting day in, day out of how Chamisa is the best foot forward for the country, regardless of his lying. How that could be so beggars belief. The rural people, some of them do not have access to information, but at least they've got common sense. What we have in the urban center, in the urban voter, is somebody who doesn't even have common sense. We could argue with some of them endlessly and still get absolutely nowhere. They still believe that Chamisa is the best foot forward, regardless of the fact that Chamisa and his MDC, CCC friends have failed to implement even one democratic reform in 24 years. And he has been participating in these flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy. It it is comforting to hear people like Margaret Dongo, who at least can see behind the smoke screen of these MDC CCC lies. Of course, CCC leaders participated last year's elections out of greed. Of course, it is foolish to argue that they were doing it as a favor to the nation. I would like to conclude this talk with playing a video, short clip video of the gentleman, Dr. Navas Mumba, who was the chairperson of the SADC election observer mission that condemned last year's elections. And his advice is that it's for Zimbabweans themselves to push for the reforms. Or to put it slightly differently, to stop participating in flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy.
But I'm saying in the case of Jacob Zuma, you can't act the way he has acted and hope to maintain an old relationship, because he has broken that relationship. He's broken that relationship. You can't campaign against the ANC and pretend that the ANC believes.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, let me be clear that the changing of any dynamic or situation in any of our African countries is a preserve of the citizens of that country, in this case, the Zimbabwean people. An election observation team goes there to support the process by observing and being able to release a statement of our observations that, for instance, in Zimbabwe, we raised several issues of transparency and also the independence of the Electoral Commission and things which happen in many other countries, you know. But at the end of the day, once we produce the report and make it available to the Zimbabwean authorities and eventually to the Zimbabwean people, it really remains the preserve of the Zimbabwean people to fight for the freedoms that they need themselves and to correct those issues that have been observed. The reason why we have multiple observation missions is to ensure that, you know, there is a comparison, you know, taking place between the SADC report and the European Union report, the African Union report, and then they can see that those issues that repeat themselves in all these reports, it's up to the Zimbabwean people. And this is where I appeal to all political leaders, not only in Zimbabwe, especially the elections that are coming in Mozambique, that are coming in South Africa, in DRC. We have to make up our minds that, look, at the end of the day, once the people in the country are given an opportunity to monitor the elections, because they also monitor, it starts not during the day of the elections. They must make sure that the constitutional lacunas that can affect a good election are dealt with months before the election, and they must fight to ensure that there's a level playing field. They should never wait for the time when the election is taking place. They must also insist that the electoral commissions and the governments in those countries abide by international norms in holding democratic elections. And this fight must be more vicious before the election comes.
So in closing, the number one fight for the people of Zimbabwe right now is to make sure that we do not participate in the 2028 elections without reforms. We must fight for those reforms. If Chamisa and company failed to implement even one token reform in 24 years, including 5 in the GNU, it is naive to still believe that they're still fighting in our corner. Particularly when we know, like Margaret Dongo rightly pointed out, they are now using politics as an an opportunity for them to lie in their own nests. They will participate in these flawed elections no matter what, because they are attracted by Zanu PF bribes. An MP who gets elected gets a US $60,000 car. In November last year, or rather in 2022, Mnangagwa gave all the MPs a $40,000 US housing loan. That's of course a bribe. And those bribes were to go through all the other systems to help him rig the elections. But I'm sure that MPs will get another $40,000 a housing loan. And then there's the very generous salary. And this is what Margaret Dongo was saying there. These MPs will contest these elections and hope that those bribes will help them recoup their expense. Our right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country is now being compromised by people who are participating in these flawed elections out of greed. How we could have failed to see that even after 24 years, beggars belief. What has gone wrong? I think we Zimbabweans are incredibly naive. How we have allowed ourselves to be conned and cheated for 44 years by Zanu PF, 24 years by MDC CCC, speaks volumes of who we are, of how naive and gullible we Zimbabweans are. Zimbabwe is a failed state because we failed to govern ourselves. This is a serious challenge, and one which we have got to face. The longer we allow this insanity to continue, the harder it's going to be to get out of it. The Zanu PF has got many people who have invested interest now in maintaining the status quo. They are not going to give up power easily now. They've tested it. The opposition will be hell-bent on making sure that they participate in the 2028 elections to recoup the expense, as Margaret Dongo so kindly put it. And meanwhile, perpetuate the Zanu PF dictatorship. Meanwhile, the country sinks deeper and deeper into the abyss. It is within our power to change it. Whether we choose to exercise that power or not, it's up to us. Thank you very much for listening.